There's the button. All right, we're now recording, Brandon, so go right ahead.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Tom. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm still morning over here in Denver, but hope all of you are doing well and having a wonderful week so far. We're halfway through at this point. As Tom mentioned, I've known Tom for a while now. We were both members and kind of worked together hand in hand for the Denver user group for a little bit. And Tom, I'll joke and say that he cornered me at the past summit this year, and was curious if I'd be willing to give a presentation. It really wasn't that bad. I was more than happy to give this presentation. So a little bit about me. I have my Bachelor of Science in Computer Science from Newmont University out in Salt Lake City. I do have a current MCSE for the data platform. Knowing how Microsoft is changing their certification programs, I will probably have a different title at some point. I've kind of spanned a wide range of database realm. I've been a DBA, I've been a DB dev, I've been a consultant. Most recent development is I'm now managing. I have no idea who thought that was a good idea for me. Tech people being managers, a little bit awkward, but you know, it's an interesting experience. In terms of the industries I've worked in, I'm currently in the financial industry. I work for Oppenheimer Funds. I'm a working manager and a tech lead there. I've worked as well in the health insurance, transportation, and education industries as well. My experience with SQL Server has been from 2005 all the way up to the most current version. So it's wild to think that it's been 11 to 12 years now that I've been working with the product. Presented at events in multiple states. I have a pretty good case of wanderlust. Usually I pull in a nice little photo or something from my most recent trip. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to get one in for this. My most recent adventures took me to Australia and New Zealand, so those were pretty fun. If you have any interest in tracking me down on LinkedIn, if you have any questions after the presentation, feel free to hit me up there. My information is right there. It's relatively easy and pretty short to try and get. Just in terms of my presentation style, I say presentation very loosely. I don't like giving presentations. I don't like just flapping my gums and talking to you guys. I want this to be a very useful experience for you, so I say that I like to have discussions rather than presentations. So if you have questions while we're going through this, please feel free to reach out to Tom, and he'll do his best to communicate that question to me while we're going through this. My goal is to get to the end and have no questions whatsoever, so please feel free to, and please don't hesitate to ask questions as they come up. I do want this to be useful for you. So the agenda that we have going for today, Hurricane Sandy itself, a little bit of background, what the timeline looked like, and what we had to do as a team to, as a company to start working through all the processes and whatnot that we had in place for plans. Actually declaring the disaster, what that looked like, what we did well, what could have gone better. We could just retitle that section as what we didn't do well, but we have to put the PC version on there. How we actually failed everything back, brought everything back over to its original systems and production systems, and kind of what we're doing moving forward after going through all of those fun processes and plans. We'll have a recapping Q&A at the end, but again, like I said, please feel free to ask questions as they come up. So a little bit of background with Hurricane Sandy. It made U.S. landfall on Monday, October 29th, 2012. It was right around Halloween time frame, so that was kind of fun. It was the largest Atlantic hurricane on record. It was a Category 3 at peak intensity, and they have nice little scales to tell you how many mile-per-hour sustained wind to get to those particular points. It was the second costliest hurricane in U.S. history, right behind Katrina. Makes you appreciate a little bit of how serious this was. It was the deadliest U.S. East Coast hurricane. It was even more deadly than Hurricane Andrew. One of the bigger impacts were the 13-foot storm surges on the East River. That is the river that runs right next to Lower Manhattan, and also where our New York office is. It was the first weather closure of the New York Stock Exchange since 1985. It was the first 2-day weather closure since 1888. So I'll give you a little bit of background there in terms of everything that was wrapped around Hurricane Sandy. The timeline itself, I kind of have put this table together to show parallel timelines in terms of what the storm was doing and what my company Oppenheimer Funds was doing at the time. On Sunday evening, Sandy actually made landfall, and I know I was actually at a Broncos game, a Sunday night Broncos game, when I got the call saying that we needed to start battening down the hatches and figuring out what we needed to potentially do in case this did actually hit us. Hopefully there's some football fans out there, and hopefully not too many Patriots fans. So Monday morning, heavy rain started in New York, and at 4 a.m. Mountain Time or 6 a.m. Eastern Time, we had on-calls online and performing checks, making sure systems were hopefully in the best state possible, knowing that there was a good chance that we were actually going to declare a disaster. Rain continued heavily throughout the rest of the day. At 7 p.m., Con Edison, who is the power provider for Manhattan, actually cut the power to lower Manhattan. That was a preventative and precautionary measure to actually try and preserve some of their infrastructure so that salt water and whatnot was not in the power lines while they were on and caused much more issues than they needed to. As soon as they cut power to lower Manhattan, our backup generators started kicking on for the building. 2 hours later, at 9 p.m., the storm surge had reached over 13 feet. So essentially we're just saying that the waterways around Manhattan rose 13 feet higher than they normally are. Kind of a big deal when you're butted right up against rivers and oceans and all that. If anyone remembers the news coverage and whatnot, there was actually a transformer explosion that occurred. That was roughly at about 9 p.m. that night. At that same time, roughly around that, we actually had the storm surge begin to flood our generator in our building. That generator was sitting in the basement. I'll let that sink in and we can laugh at it because we were laughing at it as well. At that point, battery power was engaged. Unfortunately, battery power does not power our HVAC system. And we had servers that were starting to go up to 200, 300 degrees Fahrenheit. And pretty much we were on the call, and the question came up of, well, how long can we proceed like this? And they said, you know what, we can run it until the server literally melts. And we just won't have the hardware as soon as we come back up from whatever this is. So at 10 p.m. that night on Monday, we declared a disaster as a company. We began starting to fail over all of our systems and initiate all the plans that we had at that point. The stock exchange was closed for part of that Monday. It was also closed on that Tuesday, but shockingly enough, Wednesday morning, that was our target date where we knew that we had to have everything from our trading systems to our reporting systems back up and online and ready to go. So that was our time frame.
Hey, Brandon, I do have one question that's come up. They're asking, what are the challenges you have with working with the infrastructure team and testing and keeping the DR plan ready?
That's a great question. I do cover parts of that during this presentation. I think testing it, I mean, just actually going through it and performing the actual plan while you're not in a disaster is the best thing you can do. Having a plan in place and never testing it is terrible. You are setting yourself up to fail. You may dust it off once every few years and you realize that it applied to SQL 2000 when you're on SQL 2014. That kind of stuff won't work. It's a very iterative and repeatable thing that you need to do in terms of making sure that your plan works. Very much like you double check and make sure you're taking backups. You have to test your DR plan on a periodic basis to make sure that you're doing what you're saying you're supposed to be doing and making sure that you're matching your excuse me, your RTOs and your RPOs. Hopefully that answers the question. Tom, any others, or should I keep moving?
Keep moving on.
All right. So I have a nice little note here that we have movie time coming up. So I will share this movie, and strangely enough, I don't know why, but I won't hold it against people. This is what people enjoy the most from this presentation is this little movie. Not me speaking, not me describing. So what you're seeing here is water rushing into the basement of our building where the generators are. That water is coming from the East River, just flooding straight into the basement. I'll go one more without any sound so I can actually speak over it. But you can see, actually I'll just pause it right here for a moment. You can see how much water is already down here in that basement. Can't even get down to the floor, and it's almost actually up to the ceiling there in that basement. And just rushing down, nothing stopping it, nothing getting in the way. So that's where our backup generators were. Obviously that doesn't really work too well when we need those backup generators for power for the building. So that's our fun little movie time. Hopefully you enjoyed it. So this is what Lower Manhattan looked like at the time that I put together this presentation, and looked like on the night of, or what it looks like on a normal night. Just to give you a little bit of perspective of what it looked like after the power shut down and during Hurricane Sandy. That's what it looked like. If you've ever been to New York, you know that there are lights on 24/7, and you definitely do not have that in this photo. So on a normal day and during Hurricane Sandy. So kind of a big deal there. So in terms of the actual disaster itself and how we declared the disaster, thankfully, I guess thankfully is a weird word to say here, but thankfully it was what we kind of like to call a delayed disaster. We knew something was coming. It wasn't a tornado dropped out of the sky or something blew up in the building or whatever it might be that caused an immediate outage. We had nearly 24 hours to prepare. The question that we always like to ask ourselves is, how would it have been different if it was a little bit more sudden? I think over the course of the exercise we realized that some teams just weren't prepared for this, and even having that 24 hours, they still weren't prepared when we actually declared the disaster. What was very interesting for us as a team at the time, we had 6 DBAs as part of the team. We had 1 DBA on vacation, so that's always fun. Our New York, New Jersey DBA, he was right in the thick of everything, and you know what? If Lower Manhattan doesn't have power, there are going to be some surrounding areas that don't have power either. So we heard from him very early on and knew that he was safe and okay, but he did not have any connectivity until that Friday. So we're talking Monday until Friday. And then we had 2 DBAs that were relatively new hires. So we had 2 DBAs on staff at the office that were right a rock and familiar with the systems, 2 that were newer to everything that we do for our SQL Server environments, and 2 that were out of communication. So of course that just happened to happen during the disaster. How we ended up having to work it was, we were doing up to 20-hour days in overlapping shifts. It's kind of at that point where you always think that you'll train well for disaster, but until you actually go through it, you never know how your body will respond. I think I did end up clocking over a 100-hour work week that week, to the point where I got back to my house on Sunday evening, and I don't think I left the house until Saturday the next week, essentially. So a good solid 6 days at home. That was just watching the Weather Channel and being on conference calls, pretty much. At the time, for mission critical stuff, we had 8 production instances that had to be recovered in Denver, which is our backup location, our disaster location for New York. We had 20 plus non-production instances that had to get brought over as well. We had at the time, so we're talking 2012 timeframe, a mixture of log shipping and storage level replication for the systems in question. We had started to roll out Always On for 2012, but with it being such a new technology around that time frame, it wasn't really rolled out to production at that point. So we were kind of stuck in the old school way to perform DR under SQL Server. Before I start jumping into what went well, Tom, are we doing good on questions?
Yep, we are.
All right, great. So in terms of what went well for us, how we actually went through the process right before failing everything over is one of our first steps after we were given the go-ahead to begin failing systems over was we made our databases read-only that we were going to bring over. What that did for us is it allowed us to know a very set point in time, no more data is going in here. We have written all of the data that we know about. Anything that tries to after this point won't succeed, so we'll know that. And it provided a hard stop time for us, such that knowing that we took a differential or a T-log or a full backup after that we were going to encompass every piece of data that we had. We script out all of our database DDL statements, or our create database statements. Having those and knowing what we have to expect in Denver and on our Denver instances was crucial. It was wonderful to have those. It came into handy on a variety of different occasions. So I would definitely encourage you that if you're not currently today scripting out some level of DDL of all of your instances that you manage, or that you work with if you're a DB dev, or that you have applications on top of if you're an app dev, definitely consider scripting out DDL and storing it somewhere where if you did have a disaster, that you could have access to those. We did have login scripts. So SP help rev login has been around for ages. Essentially, it's just a stored proc that will script out specific information about logins on a SQL Server instance, both their SIDs and their hashed passwords and everything along those lines. There are some newer scripts and whatnot that can handle that, but if you're looking for something that is what we still use today actually at our company, it works perfectly for what we need, and just having those login scripts was great to be able to make sure that we were streamlined in our disaster environment, our DR environment, when we brought it online. We were still use and did use at that time CNAMEs or DNS aliases for pretty much all of our SQL Server instances. It is a wonderful practice to do, where essentially creating this CNAME record just ends up pointing to a different host name. That allows us to migrate database servers very easily. In a DR situation, it causes no config string or connection string changes, no configuration changes in applications. They will still point at the same CNAME, and we will just bring on the server that we expect to be providing DR functionality and repoint that DNS alias. Our team did actually a very good job of division of tasks and applications. Essentially, we knew that we had 8 production instances, and however many applications that meant that we had to bring over. Very early on, once we had the most mission critical system up, I mean, it was a little bit of a rush to get those specific systems up. I mean, 2 or 3 of them that just absolutely had to be up immediately. Once we had a chance to breathe for just a couple minutes, we started pulling up, all right, here's everything that we need to accomplish to perform our DR plan as a team. And we just divvied it out and said, you know what, if you have questions, come back to the team, but do everything you can to bring these systems online. So we were able to divide that out very well as a team. We had good failover status documentation while we were going through this. What I mean by that is when we realized really early on that as we were starting to bring systems online, that there wasn't necessarily clear communication around what state they were in, what time the data was current from, if they had lost any of their data, if some of their batch cycles were running and didn't come over in time. So what we did is we actually put together a spreadsheet for all of our applications, all of our databases, all of our instances, and said, here's the old server name, here's the new server name, here is the backup file that we used, and we actually put the full path on the NAS for our backup file so that we could reference it on our team. But we were also able to put, this is the time that the backup was taken, and we also put a time that we restored and had the database and system online in Denver. People were able to reference that multiple times throughout the week, and that was one of the most useful pieces of information that we had put together. Our team maintains essentially a metadata database or repository database. Essentially, it goes out and it scoops all the metadata on our SQL servers, database names, instance names, database files, those types of pieces of information. What was actually incredibly helpful with it is that we actually restored a copy of that database as it existed right before we declared a disaster. So we knew exactly what our state across our enterprise looked like on our SQL Server footprint right before we declared the disaster. So easier said than done in terms of having that and integrating that into your DR plan. However, if you have similar functionality, if you're looking at something like a SQL Sentry, or sorry, Sentry 1, or similar other products, maybe loading up your monitoring database as a copy right before the disaster happened would be able to give you that type of information as well. We did have some very good company-wide camaraderie. People banded together very well. It's amazing how people can try and throw each other under the bus one day in a meeting to other people's managers, and then the next day when they're in the trenches with each other, it's like it never happened. It does bring people together very well, and you know, the people that were not playing well with others, they end up not being very successful during this exercise. And it was called out at multiple times during the actual disaster. So it's a perfect time to, for lack of better words, leave your title at the door. At that point, you are all just people, part of that company, trying to get that company back up and running. And it doesn't matter what your title is and what your job function is. Everyone is responsible for making sure that your company is running and doing what it's supposed to do during normal operation. Any questions at this point, Tom, or should we keep going forward? I know that was a lot of talking there.
Looks like you can continue talking.
Wonderful. So now the what didn't go so well, or what could have gone better, the nice little PC way of putting it. The thing that bit us the most was we did not have a one-for-one DR setup. What I mean by that is that for every server that we had in New York, we did not have one server in Denver that provided exactly the same functionality. There were some efforts to do some cost savings and have shared instances, have multiple instances on a piece of hardware that didn't have those multiple instances in New York. We noticed that we were struggling from a resource perspective for some of those systems. When we brought them online, we kind of had to scramble a little bit after the fact. We also had inconsistent ports and instance names. So we may have had a named instance out in New York, and we had a default instance in Denver. So again, not one for one, and just caused us a little bit of pain and complexity when we're actually going through the disaster itself. So publishing the list of backup and recover 2 times, we were asked that very early on, and it kind of, you saw it on the previous slide of once we did it, it was great. We didn't do that right at the start, and it caused a lot of confusion. So we picked up pretty quickly that that was something that we needed to do. There was also the notion of up-to-date data and not being able to recover it. We had, since it was most of a trading day in the New York office, we do have some end of trading day processes that kick in, and people wanted to try and run some batch cycles after the market closed, but before anything happened with the systems. Now, everyone, especially on the application developer side and maybe the database developer side, their thought was, well, you know what, we think that we're going to declare disaster at, say, 7 p.m. If we have that batch process done by 6:30, then we're fine. We have plenty of time. We actually even have an extra half hour. Well, what they don't think and what the DBAs do think about is that, you know, that process is great. It can finish up, but you still have to back that data up and you still have to copy it across the wire. And if we're talking large databases here, that is not going to necessarily be easy. We had one staging database where they were trying to do that batch run, and you know what, we weren't able to get it across in time for our storage subsystem. I mean, we did fry one of our pieces on our storage subsystem just because it ran so hot. We weren't able to copy it over as fast and in time, so they had to have their family of databases in an inconsistent state between them when we first brought them online. They end up having to come back to us and say, you know what, yes, we screwed up. We shouldn't have done that, but because they're in an inconsistent state, we actually need you to throw away all the rest of the data for some of these other places and restore all of them into a consistent state from earlier in the day. Now, that's probably what we should have done in the first place, but, you know, that's what they requested, and so that's what we did for them. You can't always control that particular timeline. I know that the other time that Oppenheimer's declared a disaster was for 9/11. The war stories that I heard from someone that used to be on my team was that she was copying database backups from the New York office, and at one point the transfer just stopped and froze, and that was when the tower actually fell down. It was kind of just an incredible story when she tells it like that, and something that puts it into very relevant terms for us as DBAs is something as simple as a backup file being transferred across and a building falling down and that connection getting severed. So, in lighter news, back to our fun disaster. Definitely allow for plenty of time if possible. Pad your timings, pad your windows. We just didn't allow for that when we were trying to sneak in that last batch cycle right before the disaster got declared.
Got one question for you there.
Sure.
So how do you team up with the application team in making sure the DR plan is current or accurate, and what challenges do you face?
Great question. And from our perspective, the mantra I think that will be coming out from most of this presentation is test your plan. Work with the application developers, work with database developers, work with the business. I mean, you have to have business buy-in to perform your DR tests and exercise your plan. Otherwise, it's useless. It's just a plan, and you have no idea if it actually works. The challenges that you can run into, and I will touch on it a little bit in later slides as well, how are you able to actually test your DR plan when you need those systems for production, and maybe they're the same names and whatnot? I mean, there are challenges that you do have to consider, but I mean, from our perspective, and if I could wave a magic wand in terms of how we do our disaster recovery exercises today, it would be literally fail everything over to the other geographic location and run that way for a week. And you'll know really quickly when you're trying to run normal business on a secondary location that if something's not working, that'll bubble up to the top very quickly. If you're doing a DR exercise where you just bring the backup systems online, do a couple of connection tests, and then shut them back down, you're not testing all the different facets of the business. You're not running reports. You're not doing an end-of-day batch cycle. You're not doing whichever aspect of your business and your processing you want to consider. You're not testing those parts of the disaster plan. So the challenges are getting the buy-in from the business, realizing that there could be a little bit of disruption and business disruption, but for the benefit of a little bit of peace of mind and having a proper plan in place. So hopefully that answers the question there. Like I said, I will cover a little bit more aspects of it here in a couple more slides. Just finishing up this slide here that we're on. What could have gone better? The physical vulnerability. Why would we put a generator below floodline in a basement right next to a river? I mean, I don't know if anyone had ever considered that we would have a 13-foot storm surge, but those are things that should be considered when planning for your disaster. Maybe it will cause you to consider just a little bit more what could go wrong. I mean, if you're a small company and you have a server just sitting in a closet, what happens if a pipe bursts right above that server? Does it make sense to put something to protect it from water there? Does it make sense to have it up off the ground? Does it make sense to have it off-site such that you don't have to worry about those type of things? Definitely consider your physical vulnerability as well. We thought we had covered a lot of it, but there were some aspects that just weren't thought through. Continuing on the what could have gone better, application teams struggling to bring up their systems. Most of our mission critical databases, and this is not a ego type of slide that the DBAs are awesome and that the application teams are terrible, but it was just stating the facts that most of our mission critical databases were online and ready within 30 minutes of declaring that disaster. And the only reason it took as long as that did was extra checkout that we were performing just to make sure that everything was in good shape. I think the databases themselves were online within 15. We didn't have any sort of automatic failover at that point. We didn't have always on at that time. Clustered instances, I mean, we didn't have anything clustered geographically dispersed, and we did not have database mirroring. So we did not have any automatic failovers kicking in. It was all manual failovers. The interesting part was that there were some applications or some application teams that weren't ready for nearly a day and a half. They were scrambling because either their DR plan had not been tested or they did not test it well enough. So for our failback, we actually waited for an entire month before we failed back. So we ran everything from our New York office in Denver for an entire month. That was mostly just because New York wasn't quite ready for it. They did not have the generators for the building, so we didn't have backup power. So there was very little appetite to fail back too soon and potentially have another issue or outage. It took an entire weekend to perform all of our failback and checkouts and everything like that. That was a full 48-hour weekend worth of work. How we actually accomplished it from a DBA perspective is we set up log shipping for a lot of the databases back to their original homes. So that allowed us to, every 15 minutes, just get transactions out there. And even for databases that weren't normally set up for log shipping, this allowed us to do a very quick failover. And we prepped this before the actual weekend such that our piece went as fast as possible. We actually did some planned upgrades during the process. A little bit risky maneuver, but it did provide us an opportunity where we were able to put some applications on a newer version of SQL Server, and obviously discussed with people before doing that. We also did some planned relocations during the process, so moving databases from one instance to another. So it did give us a little bit of a business case to do some of the work that we wanted to do. And we had to reevaluate a little bit what our current architecture and setup was. We had to look at some of our New York applications and say, well, you know what? In general, New York is a little bit more susceptible. I mean, we have terrorism attacks. We have weather events that could potentially harm our New York systems. I'm sitting here in Denver, and it is a bright, sunny day, and the worst that we really get are fires and blizzards. And there's not really a whole lot else in terms of natural disasters. I mean, tornadoes will be a little bit further east than us. I mean, they can happen, but we do have a little bit safer natural disaster footprint here in Denver. So the thought process was, well, can we just move some of these applications to Denver and reduce that risk or minimize that risk? So moving forward and kind of what our takeaways were and our lessons learned and how we got better because of this entire disaster is we actually improved our PowerShell scripts. This was actually a very fascinating slide 3 or 4 years ago when I was first put this presentation together. It's a little bit less interesting these days. But we did have scripts to automatically perform a log shipping failover. Normally that's a very manual process, but we put scripts together and tested them and had them ready to go such that when we did the failback, we used those scripts that we were trying to hack together during the disaster itself, and we're very successful with that. I would expand upon that statement saying that scripts are your friend. Things that are repeatable and that people know where they are and can be rerun multiple times and tested easily and no one-off processes are great for preparing for disasters. Getting closer to a one-for-one DR architecture, especially for mission-critical applications. Anytime the business comes to us now and says, hey, we want to save a little bit on DR, we shut the conversation down from the word go and just remind them of Hurricane Sandy. And that is usually enough to get them to come back in their statement and say, yeah, you know what, you're right. We did experience some pain because of that, and we'll dish out the extra $1,000, $10,000, $50,000. I know that's a lot of money to a lot of people, but from a larger business and a business that has actually gone through a disaster, those costs are minimal compared to not having your business up and going in the event of a disaster. Business buy-in for more automatic failover technology. I think this was me on my soapbox back in 2012, 2013 when I put this presentation together. Getting adoption for always on. If you have not tried using the always on technology that was introduced in SQL 2012 and has been improved in the version since, I would highly encourage you to take a look at it. Spin up a lab environment, start kicking the tires with it. I mean, it is a wonderful, wonderful technology, and it provides incredible DR functionality that will make your life easier. If you're not able to get to, say, an always-on type of scenario, look at database mirroring. If you're not able to accomplish any of these from the SQL end, look at something from the OS layer or the storage layer. If you're working with VMware, look at SRM. There are pieces of functionality that you can get that will aid you in the event of an actual disaster. It always is an afterthought to a lot of people, and you just need to put the time and effort into planning for it. So going back to the questions that have popped up a lot, here is just the one little bullet, and I'll spend a little bit of time on it since it is an interesting topic, of just better disaster recovery exercises, testing your plan. And the first point is controlled tests that don't impact the business aren't enough. And I'm not saying run out and go impact the business. That's not our job as technologists. We're not supposed to impact the business if possible. However, you do have a need for actually running your systems, say, out of a secondary location for a few days, testing the full life cycle of what your systems look like. I would also throw in there that there should be some sort of sudden and unplanned exercise. We have always, as a team, said that we would love to get to the point where on Tuesday at 1 p.m. we get notification through our messaging system at the company that we are doing a disaster drill and we're failing everything over, or failing a couple systems over, or whatever it might be, to Denver or to New York, to our secondary site. We have said that that needs to occur, and we have been shut down by the business just because of a risk. And I totally understand their viewpoint, but it does not help us plan better in the event that that kind of thing actually happens. So if you have the ability, if you are on the business side here in this presentation, or if you're on the application development team, work with the business to try and figure out ways to be able to fully test your plan. And I'm not saying bringing it up in the secondary site, doing a lights on and a smoke test, and then turning it back off. In my eyes, that is not a disaster recovery exercise. That is something that we are all trained to do very early on of how to turn a computer on. That's it. It does not fully test your plan and prove that your plan works. Any questions at this point? I've been talking for a good long while now, so.
No, we don't have any questions at this point.
All right. So actually that is towards the end of the presentation here. So just to recap what we chatted about, we did describe what Hurricane Sandy was, the timeline for it, how we actually declared the disaster as a company and what the processes looked like and what we actually did on our team to pull that off. Discussed things that went well. There were plenty of things that went well. There were plenty of things that didn't go as well. But it was a learning exercise for sure. It's not something that you can teach someone. You just have to go through it. And I can try to give you all the information that I have and the lessons that I've learned, but until you go through testing your DR plan itself, you won't know it as well as you should during a disaster. We also chatted about Failback and what that looked like. Interesting techniques that we used to try and minimize the downtime during the actual failback itself. And that was setting up the log shipping back to our original production systems, and some interesting things that we did while Failback to drive the business forward as well. And then kind of how we assimilated all of the information that we learned from the exercise and what we're doing better moving forward. I would say that because of Sandy, that gave us a very good business case for rolling out more always-on environments, especially in a virtualized environment. Most of our footprint these days is virtual. I think we're 97% virtual at the moment in terms of our instances. The recoverability that we have because of virtualization technologies is incredible. And it's only going to get better and better. There is now, I mean, cloud is becoming very relevant, and especially with regulatory loosening a little bit and businesses having an appetite for it, as well as the actual offerings themselves between Azure and AWS and whatever other cloud offering you would potentially consider. There are plenty of opportunities there to make your disaster plans a little bit more robust and a little bit more resilient.
Okay,
So
we've got a
that's
couple questions that have come in.
Wonderful.
One question is, why did it take 2 hours after the generator came on to declare a disaster?
So there were a lot of discussions and whatnot. We were on battery power. So the systems didn't shut off or anything because the generator was off. Our battery power kicked in, and I think there were probably some people out there, especially on the business side, that said, oh, well, we're on battery power, it's fine. The batteries should be able to last us through whatever happened with the generators or until we can get power turned back on. I don't think what they realized was that, to my point, that it didn't power the HVAC system. And so you had servers that were running there without air conditioning, essentially, and in a data center that was just growing temperature-wise by the minute. And I think everyone here knows what happens to computers when you don't give them adequate cooling. So that was that's why there was that gap in between. And there was hesitation. I mean, the business was a little bit hesitant to declare a disaster too early. I mean, if we could have had power to the building for a couple days and everything would have been fine, declaring that disaster would have been a huge impact if we didn't have to do it for whatever reason. So I think the business themselves was very hesitant to do anything over the top without knowing for sure that that was their only course of action. So hopefully
Okay.
that answered that question. That's a great question.
All right. What are your facilities like in Denver before Sandy? And what are your thoughts on use of AWS or like resources for VM recovery, which you just discussed just a second ago?
Sure.
So,
So I mean, our Denver, I think that we learned lessons from the actual disaster itself. I mean, since then, I mean, this is over 4 years ago now, and since then, obviously, technology has matured as well. So I think the biggest changes that we see in Denver after Sandy are that we are much more virtualized. We're in a much more horizontal scale out type of mantra when it comes to database servers that come in. So we try to isolate things a little bit better from other applications. Because the virtualization technologies we're able to do one for one much better. And even for bare metal systems that we have gotten the business case pushed through where whatever you buy in one of the locations, you have to buy in the other location as well. Exact same specs, you just add one to the quantity of whatever you're ordering. And thankfully, we've gotten that buy-in. In terms of the cloud offering aspect of the question, we've finally gotten the go-ahead as a company and as a technology organization to start moving forward with exploring cloud offerings. I know that from an Azure perspective, there is the ability to create replicas on Azure. And I think one of the things that we will be exploring here over the next probably 6 months or so is what does it look like if we start taking the always-on clusters that we have and I mean, that are already geographically dispersed. I mean, they'll have nodes in Denver and DR nodes in New York and vice versa. What does that look like if we change the DR nodes to Azure replicas? That's something that we'll be looking at. In terms of a cloud offering, in terms of AWS, I mean, we'll be building out servers in the cloud, and knowing their redundancy is great, but I mean, we will still have to plan from a DR perspective on our end as well if that data center had some sort of issue. I mean, it's great to think that once you put it in the cloud, there will be no outage, but you're still relying on someone else's agreement, and whether or not they break that agreement is one thing, but that doesn't help you if your business is actually down. So hopefully that answers the question, and I'm definitely happy to elaborate on other facets of it if you'd like, or offline it if you would like to shoot me a message afterwards. I'm happy to discuss.
okay. Uh, do you have a lot of client server applications? How did they do in the GR situation? How did remote users connect to those client server applications? Citrix or slash virtual computer?
Gotcha. Great question. Yeah, we do have a lot of client server applications. Those applications were managed by individual application teams during the disaster. The biggest thing that we noticed, I mean, was latency. I mean, when you're used to applications talking in New York to New York, and suddenly they're having to go all the way across the wire back to Denver, I mean, there is a level of latency that occurs. And that's just part of the nature of the beast when that happens. In terms of our connectivity to our work network, I mean, we do have VPN set up, and we have VPN set up in all of our geographic locations, our actual physical locations. So VPN was not really an issue. We were able to get to everything relatively easily. So great question, though.
Okay, and then you mentioned about log shipping or always on as part of the DR plan. Any performance implications that you've seen there?
So log shipping, there's not really any performance hit on log shipping except for the fact that you'll be taking more T-log backups. But I hope that you're taking T-log backups anyway. So that is kind of a wash. In terms of always on, yes, there is a performance hit. You can customize always on based on your needs and based on your performance hits. There are the notion of asynchronous as well as synchronous replicas for always on. Asynchronous behaves in very similar to a log shipping type of setup where you finish a transaction, it goes into a log of some sort, and it gets shipped off, and it gets replayed back on the destination. There is a minimal performance impact there. The synchronous replicas are where you'll actually see some level of performance hit. And what those are doing are those are guaranteeing that anytime that you run a transaction, that transaction has to complete successfully on all the other synchronous replicas before it is marked as successful on the original replica. So it's not saying that whatever your transaction time is, it's going to be multiplied by however many synchronous replicas you have. But there definitely will be a performance impact to some degree. So it is something to consider. The question then just boils around what type of failover are you wanting in an always-on setup? If you're wanting automatic failover, you have to have synchronous replicas. If your RPO is much higher, and you can tolerate a little bit more data loss, if we're talking more than an hour, more than a day, whatever your RPO might be, then you can explore doing asynchronous replicas and doing a manual failover. And we do that with some of our always-on clusters. We've set up 1+1s for strictly DR purposes. We're not providing high availability on them, and those have worked well for us as well. So the typical DBA answer is going to be it depends in terms of what the performance impact is, but I would encourage you, if you have not started to explore always on, to at least, if you have the ability to spin up virtual environments, just spin them up, try and cluster them together, try and get always on set up. I mean, you'll learn a lot in the process. It's not an easy task. It's a little bit of a steep learning curve at first, but once you get there, it's very cookie cutter and very easy after that point.
Well, the other thing now with always on, you can even put your replica up into the cloud. So, you don't even have to necessarily have it on site or in some other
Absolutely.
remote data center. So,
Yep.
even
And
though the
that just
cloud,
provides,
yeah, even though the cloud is a remote data center. So, yeah,
right. Yeah, it just provides you yet another geographic location as a fallback.
right, right. Well, Brandon, that looks like all the questions today. I appreciate you pulling this one out of the archive. I personally saw it 4 years ago, and it was great. But you forgot to tell one story about the fuel cans.
The fuel cans.
Do you remember your fuel cans? Carrying the fuel cans up and down the stairs, trying to keep the generators running.
Oh, yeah. So we had, I had forgotten about that one. So yeah, the one last war story was when the generators were running. I mean, people were shuttling fuel to our building essentially. I mean, wherever they could get whatever was powering it. I believe they were diesel generators. But yeah, I mean, people were going up and down these stairs, just making sure that these generators still had enough gas to keep going because they were running for a lot longer than people were normally expecting them to. So just fascinating things to think about what happens during an actual natural disaster. But everyone does what they have to do to keep things going.
Yep, that's for sure. That's for sure. All right.
Well,
Well, once
I just want to
again,
throw out a big thank you to everyone. I really appreciate your time. I hope that you got some value out of all this. And please feel free to reach out to me on the side. I'm always happy to answer questions. Always happy to trade war stories and all that type of stuff. If you want to discuss the Denver Broncos, I am happy to do that as well. So, yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate it, everyone. And thank you, Tom, for the opportunity.
thanks again, Brandon. That's a great presentation for all of us to remember how to handle our DR situations because most of us have never even come close. So, knock on wood, I don't want to find out. So,
Hopefully, you
so
never have to, but it is a great experience to go through.
yeah, it is. All right. Have a great day. And thanks again. And I'll have the recording up there by the weekend. So I'll look for an email and you'll have the information on the recording up to YouTube. Thanks again, Brandon. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.